This is the second interview with John Corley, September 3rd, 1999, in the Lewis Music Library, interviewed by Forrest Larson. So I'm here with John Corley for the second interview. It's September 3rd, 1999. This is Forrest Larson. We're in the Lewis Music Library, and today we're going to talk particularly about the MIT Concert Band and related issues. So can you tell me about the early years with the concert band? I know in the last interview we talked briefly about how it got started, but if you want to go over some of that again and talk about some of the early challenges and successes, those early years.
Of course, the first few years we were busy developing the band to hit a consistent sound, tone quality, and so forth. And we had the concerts we had were not on campus so much as in the area. We played at LaSalle Junior College, a concert there. And one of the things I remember about that concert is we played an arrangement of the Royal Fireworks music of Handel, transcription of course. But we probably also played the Halt Suite No. 1, an original work. And Andrew Kasdan wrote his March Baroque early on. I've forgotten the date of composition, but it would be very early, and we did that, I'm sure. We may have played even the Weber Concertino for clarinet, transcribed for band. We were playing transcriptions as well as whatever original works I could sneak in at that point. Concerts took us down to Vassar, out to Smith College. We combined with the band at Tufts College, Tufts University, I guess it is, which was led by Bill King, who was a classmate of mine at BU, College of Music. And we joined together in concerts out there and a concert at the Shell over on the Esplanade. There again, we were playing a mixed program. The Overture to Rienzi was on that program, I remember. But there again, I kept easing in whatever original works I could find. And by 1952 or 3, somewhere in that point, we had enough original work, so the suggestion came from the students, why don't we do a concert of only original works? And indeed we did. It included one of the Halt suites. I'm not sure, it could have been the second or the first, but probably not both on the same program. And Vaughan Williams' folk song suite. I also found in a work by Samuel Barber, his Commando March, which was a very spirited, could be used as a finale piece or even as an opener. Kasdan had written Prelude and Happy Dance, which we call PhD, and we did that right away. I'd like to look up Kasdan's dates on that. J. Kasdan. March Baroque was written in 1953. And Prelude and Happy Dance was, not until 55. His invention on Two American Folk was 57. And then I'm looking ahead here, I see Suite from the Social Beaver, which was a film score he did for a movie made by MIT to show the prospective freshmen on the social life of the MIT student. and that we used winds to record that soundtrack. So those all came, you see, between 55 and 60. But we were then into playing original works only at that point. The rationale for that was in metropolitan Boston, why should we play arrangements of orchestral music when there were orchestras all around us?
Mm-hmm.
Playing orchestral music, and our own symphony orchestra was capable of playing important works for the idiom. That was really the power behind the thinking.
Right. It wasn't so much you were against arrangements because you did a fair amount yourself. Yeah.
That's right, and arrangements, of course, we'd grown up on that. Sousa, of course, was playing arrangements all the time. There were very few original works for concert band that go back any length of time. There's a Respighi, I've forgotten the date on it. I'm curious to look that up. Him. One of the few Respighi, 1932, you see, that's pretty late.
Mm-hmm.
1932.
There's a Mendelssohn kind of overture piece. What's that like?
That Mendelssohn overture is a jewel, and he wrote it. He was in his teens, or just a boy. It was at a summer resort, which had a band, which gave daily concerts, and he wrote an overture, slow opening, allegro section, and finale, and a delightful piece. We've used that a great deal. When I went to Iceland on tour with the band, I knew that they were into traditional pieces to listen to, and the Mendelssohn was our opening number, 1824, on the date of that Mendelssohn piece.
Wow.
Unfortunately, some of the other original works of that period, or the next 50 years after that point, are not too attractive. They're kind of, well, I would say high schoolish, you know, and not really challenging or rewarding for the musicians. With Andy Kasdan writing pieces for us, Ernst Levy writing his piece for us.
Yeah, the suite for band.
Yes,
Yeah.
which is actually a set of variations on the Swiss national anthem. Here's from Switzerland, from Levy, 1954, on Levy. Gregory Tuckham, which piece came early on. I played 1951. Yeah, 1951. He wrote a piece for the brass choir too. 1952. Excuse me, 1962, which we did at commencement.
Wow.
With the professional group. So the seed was planted to explore original works, works that were going to be challenging, that wouldn't waste the students' time, and had their own sound, their own band sound.
Right.
Bands have had a connotation of being cheap music, and unfortunately there's an awful lot of cheap music been written for bands, especially for school bands. Having been a school band director and adjudicator at many festivals. I've seen a lot of that junk that is so well advertised and grabbed up by high school band directors, junior high school band directors, so forth. But there again, in metropolitan Boston, while I play inferior band pieces or arrangements of good orchestra pieces, where orchestras would play them, there are only one or two transcriptions that I think sound better as band pieces than they did as orchestra pieces.
Oh, which ones are you thinking of?
One, the Portland Field from Schwanda.
I played that in high school band.
Did
yes,
you?
Yes,
And,
yes.
and with the extra trumpets on the end, bum, 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 bum.
In fact, I've never heard the orchestral version, only the band.
I've conducted both. I've conducted, of course, the band transcription. Did it with MIT many times, and the orchestra version too. I did that with the MIT Symphony. Because you could use organ plus extra trumpets, which was always made for a good finale on a concert. As you, if you remember the piece.
Yeah. So what was the other piece?
Throwing it out of my mind right now.
Well, we can get to that. But
Yeah.
so it's interesting that the idea for doing original music also came from the students. You had the
Yes, it
support
did.
there, and it wasn't
Yeah.
just you.
Students have always had a strong input into the playing of the repertoire, and many times a student will come up and say, "We should try such and such a piece. Do you know such and such a piece?" Or they'll give me a tape or something of something they had played.
Wow.
So it's been a joint effort to come up with the repertoire that over the years we've used.
Now the commissioning program, how soon did that get started after you decided to do original repertoire?
Let me check a date here. 1955 is the date I'm looking. Now the commissioning idea, the commissioning program, the word commissioning is kind of a catch-all for all kinds of things. Many times we'd receive pieces that we didn't even ask for, but they came and they were written for us, with us in mind, and that got lumped into the original works pile. Right now I'd be hard-pressed to give you an accurate list of the pieces for which we actually paid money to receive. We did, indeed, we commissioned these last two new pieces.
Right.
Were commissioned. Wherever I could, I would try to arrange for an honorarium or something of that sort to send the composer to help defray his expenses, cost of copyist and that sort of thing.
Right.
We played 2 concerts out at Smith College. We played a concert out at Smith College, and 2 Smith College students. Smith? Was this Smith? Anyway, heard the group. We did the Schoenberg variations on that concert, I remember, and liked what they heard, and they ended up coming down after the concert. Could we write something for you? And one was the RFD, the Rural Free Delivery.
Yes.
And the other was a piece which meant Helter Skelter. And I can't remember the name of it right now. It's a catchy name. see if I remember. I hope to, sorry, it takes time. STUVW. Charivari. That was with Alice Weber, yes. Which was a chamber group, solo ensemble within the full band. Charivari. Unfortunately, I didn't get to perform that very much because it needed some very excellent chamber music players down front, and it was a difficult piece to like. I liked it, I guess, more than anyone else because it was so different. It was so real, so new.
Tell me a little bit more about it. What were some of the features of it?
Slow moving, but voices weaving in and out. It was not sostenuto or long lines. It was motifs and things. I would have to look at that score again. I'd like to look at that score again. Maybe we can arrange for
another one where we can actually look at scores. I would like to do that.
Yeah.
What was the harmonic idiom like? Was it tonal or atonal or?
Atonal. I think it was mixed. I can't remember any. It's been years since I've seen this one. I can't remember any sustained or chordal section. With a lot of weaving in and out, being under the surface of the water and watching fish go in all different directions.
With the commission, particularly at the beginning when you started doing that, how much support did you get from the MIT administration? Was that fairly easy to get?
Well, I had a budget, and I would do it out of the budget.
Out of the budget.
That was provided for the year's activity of the band. There wasn't a John Corley concert band fund as we now have.
Right.
In those days. But it was done out of the band budget. But the rationale here was there wasn't that much printed music that was worth buying. Yet we were still buying printed music. We had to make sure we had all the whole suites, that we had the Vaughan Williams, that we had other pieces by established composers, Europeans, American, Copeland. Copeland scored his outdoor overture for bands, so we consider that an original. Howard Hanson was another composer who was surefire for programming, always sonorous, pleasing to the ear. Roy Harris' Cimarron was my own. I had that during the war, and when the band was deactivated, I brought it home with some other original works that I had purchased for the Army band. And we did the Roy Harris a number of times. I was very turned on personally by what Kusevitsky was doing with the Boston Symphony on original works.
He was an inspiration that way.
Yes, he was. And like I heard the first performance of the Roy Harris Third Symphony. Wonderful piece. And I did that, conducted it with the MIT Orchestra, my first or second year with the orchestra. And we subsequently did the West Point Symphony by Roy Harris with the concert band, which was not as effective as the Third Symphony or Cimarron. Cimarron has to do with the Cimarron country out in Oklahoma and the land rush. and it builds up, a tension is building up in the middle of the piece as horses and riders all were lined up for the land rush, and the gunshot would go off, and then there's horses and dust and everything. Fun. And it ends with a wonderful hymn for the band, very sonorous, quarter notes, half notes. I don't think there's even an eighth note in it. It's so sustained, and you see the horizon, you see the sky, and so much space suddenly.
Wow.
After the people have staked out their property.
Wow. So how was your philosophy of doing original music received among your fellow band conductors?
Okay, good. I had a lot of friends among the other band directors. In the early days of the New England Music Festival Association, I was on the auditioning committee for the intercollegiate band a number of years. Used to travel around to other campuses to audition their students, and we talked repertoire a great deal as we'd be writing together with the other adjudicators, and we were sharing ideas as to original pieces. I got more than one piece as a result of somebody else recommending it. Of course, the word got around that we were doing original works, and more than once somebody would write to me that so-and-so, who was a band director at University of Connecticut, has recommended I write you about a piece I'd like to send you. And unfortunately, not all the pieces that were sent to us were pieces that we did or wanted to do. As, some of them were really quite elementary, I guess, or whatever, how to describe it. They didn't show a great depth in musical experience. When I would be auditioning a candidate for band director at the Brookline schools, I would ask questions about orchestra music. What's your favorite symphony of Brahms? Which one? What recordings do you have? I wanted people who loved music and knew music, not just Brahms or Tchaikovsky. That's them. Do you have any Strauss operas? If they had only three, there are many more than the three.
Yes.
I wanted a band director who loved not just band music and band instruments and how to finger them and everything, but somebody who loved orchestra music, choral music, chamber music. And some of these pieces that were written by people for band really came through, and I doubt if they've ever heard much real orchestral repertoire. I like pieces that are well written for the instruments too. You can tell almost immediately when you open a score if there's a piece that goes off the range of the instrument.
Right.
Has low notes that don't exist on the instrument. It knows the range of the clarinet family. It knows the range of the oboe, for example.
Right. Now, when you mentioned that you're looking for music that's well written, your definition of what's well written for an instrument is more than just the traditional, expectations of instruments. So tell me a bit more about how you look at that, because you were doing some fairly, you know, contemporary repertoire.
Well, there are some people I think who write pieces just to explore or to exhibit their knowledge of the instruments, how high they can go, how low they can go. Some pieces are unnecessarily difficult. Andrew Kasdan wrote some of the most difficult passages for any instrument in his pieces because he composed at the piano. He'd played on the piano, and he might start out on the white keys, then go over into the black keys, then he'd just orchestrate that. We used to have a lot of arguments in my living room in the early days. Why did you write that piece a half step lower? He says, well, if I'd done that, what would have happened in section B, for example? You know, when it went up into the black keys, or, you know, or when it was all on the white keys, it would have been all on the black keys. So that's not a good way to compose. There are other composers who pride themselves in not using the piano. And that scares me too. One of the most recent pieces we did by the Greek composer Corley, I think he didn't use a piano at all. It was all out of his head. And sometimes I wondered whether he really knew what he was writing, whether he heard what he was writing. And it was one of the most difficult pieces I ever prepared for presentation, which was fairly recently too. He's still in the area. He H-I-J-K. $1997, yep. Dance Muflonic, yep. His piece was not really complete. It was scheduled for a performance before he had finished it. And in the last weeks before the performance, as we were then in receipt of the score and parts, I could see it needed slurs, it needed dynamics, it needed some tempo indications, or was there an accelerando all right at this point? And I must say I made a significant contribution to the finale of the piece, as I really wanted the audience to know that it was over and that it was exciting. There are ways you can do that. You can take a theme and augment it. So the same notes that you've been hearing all along are now coming at you in fuller score and twice the length, that sort of thing. You can color things with the diminution of a melody. Shostakovich's First Symphony is a wonderful example of that, first movement. The Kalindros piece really needed more time. I probably made a mistake in scheduling it without seeing it more of it. I saw it in its early form, and I believed in the composer and still do. But that was an early birth. It was not a full term.
You probably had some other experiences with composers like that too.
had an experience with a composer who had written quite a few pieces, and this composer had written a piece that we did quite a bit. St. Clair is his name, and Richard St. Clair, and he wrote a piece for 2 pianos and band, which was very attractive. We took it on tour, but he wrote a piece called something to do with Beowulf, and that was not what it was called. It was I don't spot it. Where would it be? Would it be up here?
I thought I had seen Miss Liz St. Clair someplace too. It's like, oh, here we go.
Here we
Richard
go.
St. Clair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He wrote a piece, 2 scenes from Beowulf,
Yeah.
Opus 67. That was beautifully written, wonderful manuscript and everything. Parts were good, of course. But the piece died. It just never ended. But yet the sounds had to stop sometime. And we had the embarrassing experience. It was very embarrassing for the composer. And when we finished the piece, there was no applause. I've often wondered what could I have done on the podium to attract it. But it's not the only piece that ends softly, but the material was unattractive at the end. It needed something. Now, whether it was a slow death or something, even the program notes could have helped it. More than once, I've taken a piece where I thought that might happen, and done a poor man's Lenny Bernstein, they used to call it, where I would analyze the piece for the audience, play the opening theme, and then play the ending, so they know how it was going to end ahead of time, and that has saved many pieces. I did a poor man's Lenny Bernstein on the Bavicki Symphony, and I have that on tape, and the analysis takes longer than the symphony.
Well, I do that with Webern pieces, and you know, it's a
because they're not too long sometimes. Yeah. Yeah.
So tell me about some of the notable repertoire that you've conducted that you've particularly enjoyed.
Wow.
I know that's a huge subject.
Yeah.
It's not a fair question.
Well, I must say I'm seeing the name Gregory Takara. I've enjoyed whatever he wrote very much. It was strong. There was a double concerto by Andrew Wagner for viola and clarinet, which was a challenging piece, like Alban Berg. Of course, I've always been fond of Stravinsky, and we did the symphonies for winds. We did the piano concerto more than once, and the circus polka, which was always an attractive item. Brings in toward the end, you know, Schubert Marshmallow's hair. Beep bop bop bop, beep bop 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 bop.
I haven't heard that. I'll have to listen to that. I didn't know that.
Well, it's on orchestra music, but it was written for the Sousa band, not the Sousa band, the Barnum and Bailey circus people. the Strauss, for winds only, there are just the two numbers, the Serenade Opus 7 and the Suite Opus 4. Beautiful music, but it doesn't use enough musicians to justify excusing so many players at rehearsal.
Right.
Have to keep people busy.
It's more like for an orchestral wind section. And,
that's right, exactly. Yeah. The strictly band composers, well, Persichetti is strong. Vincent Persichetti, any piece he wrote was academically so right. Whether the divertimento or the symphony or the serenade or the masquerade, virtuoso pieces.
Did you ever get a chance to work with him personally?
No, but I was in the front row when he was working with the Boston University wind ensemble many years ago now on the symphony, and he just brought that piece to life. It was wonderful what he did. Nellie Bell, Václav Nellie Bell, is a creator of a lot of strong band music, finale type from, and I've used it at music festivals when I'm conducting off stage and that sort of thing. I like very much the music of Darius Milhaud. His orchestral music.
Besides, there's a couple marches that he wrote. What other wind music did he write?
The Suite Française, which was original for band, 5 movements on provinces. Each movement's a different province in France, where American troops had fought in World War II, and it moves, it's tuneful, it's emotional. The 5 movements, a lot of contrast. We recorded that my first or second year with the concert band, and recorded it more than once. The 2 marches, one is these are Pearl Harbor pieces. The second one is Gloria Victoribus. The first movement, I think, is In Memoriam, the first march. Strong pieces. Eddie Madden is one of the most skillful orchestrators for band music. He knows every instrument so well, and very good conductor, good composer. Like very much his melodies. The Englishman Gordon Jacob. In a way, Madden is an American Gordon Jacob. The English Gordon Jacob you identify with Holtz and Vaughan Williams, and that same clean, strong style. One of the masters, of course, is Percy Grainger. His use of the saxophone choir, particularly noteworthy. He played saxophone in Army band, and obviously knew the instrument, its ranges and its colors. And you need to have a full choir of saxes, soprano sax through the bass saxophone, which gives you quite a family. Soprano, alto, tenor, maybe another tenor, baritone, and bass, really something.
Wow.
I've always enjoyed Morton Gould's music. Played a lot of it during the war. It was popular with the troops, always brought down, because I always had the feeling when I was playing concerts in the army that there were a lot of people at the concert that wouldn't normally be at a concert. But the fact that it was the army and they wanted to get away from whatever they usually do, when the band came once a month, they'd come hear the band. So I must say I also used it as an educational experience to play a new Icelandic piece that was written for us or something like that. I was in Copeland, outdoor roadshow. I mentioned and he did it himself. But his original work was emblems. And I learned of that piece from Copeland himself. I was playing at the studios at WGBH, playing trumpet for a telecast that was being filmed. And Copeland was the narrator. And during one of the breaks, we struck up a conversation. And because I played orchestral pieces of his and so forth as a trumpeter, and I mentioned that I conducted band at MIT, a very good band at MIT, and he says, "Have you tried my emblems?" And I said, "I must confess I don't know it." And the following Monday I went right out and ordered it, and it's a very strong, wonderful piece. We did that on the Icelandic tour too. It's been emblematic of American quality American music. John Bavicki has been an important part of music at MIT. The composer, he attended MIT briefly before the war, but he graduated from New England Conservatory. But he's written many pieces, and is very important as a teacher of composition at the Berklee College of Music. And it was through John Bavicki that many composers learned of a chance to have new works done at MIT.
So you first met him as a student here?
No, I met him. I heard that this man heard that I had a brass quartet that was very good. That was the Boston Brass Quartet. We were the kind of the Budapest string quartet of brass quartets. And I received in the mail this quartet from somebody named John Bavicki for 2 trumpets, trombone, and baritone, which was our quartet. And I looked at it and tried it, and it was going to be too hard for me to play, too hard for me to learn, and I returned it. Thanked him very much for sending it, but I didn't know where I'd play it either, where the type of work we were doing, the type of concerts we were giving. This was a little far out. Well, now to jump ahead a few years, I'm playing a ballet over in Boston, and in front of me is Phil Vescuria, who was my assistant here at MIT, doing woodwinds. And during the intermission, this man came down and leaned over the railing, looking down into the pit where Phil and I were still sitting, and they talked, and Phil turned around and says, "I'd like you to meet John Corley." And I looked up at this man, and he said, "Oh, you're the guy who doesn't like my brass quartet." And this big man standing over me like a giant, looking down at me. And I said it was just too hard for me to personally learn in order to play for the types of concerts we give in recitals. He said, anyway, I ended up going to his apartment the following Tuesday, I asked him, "Have you written anything other than a quartet?" And he sure had. He had tapes and tapes, and he put on his concert overture tape, which was very strong, energy, terrific finale. And I followed the score. He had a copy of the score, of course, and I ended up programming it in the very next concert for the MIT Orchestra, which I was conducting. Well, I ended up going to his apartment more than once and hearing a lot of his music. And he came to concerts of the MIT band and rehearsals of the band, and knew the instruments obviously, and ended up composing his Festival Symphony, which was a piece that I kind of wished I'd like to have something I could take around to the festivals I'm conducting with all-star high school musicians, something that could be worked up in about 3 or 4 days of rehearsals and then played. And he started work on the Festival Symphony and completed it in 1965. Is that 65? Yeah. And just this week, I heard the Festival Symphony again as it was being transferred to a CD. What a piece, and what a band that we had at MIT when we recorded that. Wow. Just so excited to hear that symphony again, and the quality of band that played it in that performance.
So is this a CD that's going to get released commercially?
No plans to that point.
Yeah.
But I have the one and only LP now. All the other copies are non-existent or have been given out.
I think we have that in the library.
Do you have it?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. If you have time sometime, listen to them.
I certainly will.
Take 25 minutes, 26 minutes.
Tell me a little bit more about the the special relationship you have with John Bevicki and some of the things in his music that particularly appeals to you.
Part one of your question, he's been a very close friend ever since we met, which was 1960, and seen me through a lot of personal troubles, and has brought me in contact with a lot of musicians that I might never have met otherwise, and men and women who have been important composers in the MIT experience. His music is very challenging. It's challenging to play. He'll write what looks to be a scale, but when you come to play it, you see there are intervals of a step and a half, as well as half steps and all, that you just can't rely on playing the scale of E. You got to suddenly realize the G double sharp and that sort of thing. His music is awfully difficult. Even easy pieces have a way of being challenging. But anyone who has played them and learned them and played them well will remember them. When I run into alumni or they call me on the phone or something, saying, "What pieces do you remember you played?" I remember the Bevicki Suite, they'll say. Or I remember the Symphony. Or they remember Concord Bridge or some of the other pieces that have been written. There were quite a few. There's probably a dozen or so pieces that we've played of his. One of the most played pieces is the Caroline's Dance. the title suggests a little girl dancing. It's true it's about a little girl dancing, but this was a memorial to that little girl. The father was a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. He used to come home on weekends, and the little girl would be happy to see him and would be dancing in his presence and all. And she'd ask for the music, and he'd put on a recording he had of John Bavicki's orchestral suite. Bum, bum, bubby, bubba, bubby, bum, bubby, bubba, bum, and on and on. And that's a part of it. And she danced to that piece. Always, it just turned her on. She died of a hemorrhage of some sort, and the father commissioned Bavicki to write a piece in her memory. And he sketched the piece, which was going to be a slow opening, using material that he would use later, and then an allegro middle section, which was the bum, bum, bubby, bum, bum, the dance section, which would melt back into the slow section, which opened the piece. And it would end just the two intervals, bum, bum, it ends on the bum, bum. Very soft, very slow. Before he started scoring it for orchestra, the girl's father died. And John and I were talking about that situation on one of the trips, on one of the tours. And he said, I asked, how about doing it for band? And then we play it with the band. And sure enough, he wrote it. He wrote two versions, one for the band and then another one for the orchestra. I've done them both.
How are they different?
There's an extra measure in the orchestra version. There's an extra measure in the transition from the allegro middle section into the slow section. Otherwise, they're the same. The scoring is different, of course.
Yeah.
It's very effective. We did that in Iceland because people reading the Icelandic translation of the story I just told you about the little girl dancing and the father dying before the piece was done, you could identify with the storyline and hear the piece. It's always been a crowd pleaser in kind of a memorial way. One of my band members said, "Do people really enjoy hearing that?" You know, it was sad, but it also pays tribute to the girl and the father, and the way it ends in the augmentation of the theme. It's hard to program sad music, especially for a band. People come to band concerts expecting marches and show medleys. I think sad music is more easily programmed for orchestra. And there's a lot of many titles to demonstrate that.
I want to talk with you later in the interview about audience expectations of bands and all that, but I want to ask you more about some other MIT composers. You had done two pieces of Paul Earle's, one called Varric in 1972 and Music from Icarus in 1981, and as we know, Paul died last October 1998.
No!
Yeah, did you know that?
No!
Yeah.
My goodness. When did he die?
October last year, 1998. Yeah.
My goodness, I'm so.
Yeah. It's a
Wow.
blow to a lot of us. Anyways, tell me about these two pieces.
Well, Werk, W-E-R-K, was the first piece he did for us. He was a baritone player, I think.
Oh, really?
And
Wow.
he knew the instrument certainly,
Yeah.
and it was a very effective piece. We set it on tour more than once. It's hard to think how to describe it, but each instrument had on their music stand, each player had on his music stand a sheet which from which he could encode his any information that he wanted. His name, the note J, the letter J might be a B natural or something like that, and a number could be encoded. And the reason for that is the band would be out in the audience. I would have the band standing scattered in the audience, not in rows or aisles, but intermixed, homogenized out through the audience. And we would code a zip code, for example, 5 digits. And I would point over here, and these people would play their zip code first digit. Then I would point over on the other side, and they would play their zip code first digit, and so forth. And somehow we had it worked out that the zip code in the town where we were playing that night would all be the same, and then we come out of unison. You know, it was their zip code, their home telephones, and their names, their initials, and there was a hymn tune involved in it. Work for the Night is Coming, or something like that. A hymn tune by that name, I think. Work for the Night is Coming. And in fact, I think we started playing that on the stage, and the people who were out in the audience. But I remember we would play that tune against the encoding information, and on one concert up in Burlington, Vermont, a woman came down. She was so upset with me for programming that hymn tune in such an awful accompaniment. You know, I apparently struck a sensitive spot in that particular hymn tune, that particular woman. That was effective. And the Icarus was done out in Killian Court, and it had to do with Icarus flying too close to the sun, and somehow the dome of the Killian Court faded in at night, and it made it nice. But we were scared because we heard a rumor that there was somebody climbing around up on the dome, and then they might fall off. And, only did that piece once.
But did that piece also include some of his work with lasers?
I think so. Yes. There again, out in Killian Court.
Yeah.
Were you there by any chance?
No.
Huh. I'm sorry to hear his death.
Yeah.
His death.
I sorely miss him.
Hmm.
I was really curious about those two pieces. Are there any recordings?
Well, I'm surveying all the tapes I have, and if there is, I shall certainly let you know.
Yeah, I got to know Paul pretty well. We had taught a class together, I also noticed, moving on here, that in 1966 you did a piece by Jacques Ibert, Concerto for Cello and Winds,
Yes.
1966.
Yes.
Who was the cello soloist for that? Do you remember?
Student. Um, um, the name that started with C, I think. Remember the orchestra, MIT orchestra. But I could look it up. And I have all the programs.
Yeah, I was really curious about that. So I didn't know about that piece.
Peter something. Wow.
That's okay. There's a lot of names over the years to keep straight. So moving back just a little bit when we were talking about repertoire, are there particular musical aesthetic ideas that appeal to your imagination, things you're looking for in music and things that excite you? I know that's a hard question. That's another one of those unfair questions.
I'm turned on by sustained, beautiful chords, passage work. For example, the trio at the end of Jerusalem Cavalier with Sophie and Octavian and the Marshal, and that wonderful trio toward the end of the opera. The big emotional climax. I always was looking for something like that in the band works we were playing. Madden came the closest to doing that in his prayers, in his suite. What is the name of that piece? Eve of St. Agnes. The Eve of St. Agnes has some wonderful emotional climaxes. Giannini, Vittorio Giannini's has some wonderful climaxes too. In the first movement, second movement, and even a little one in the scherzo movement, the third movement, where you can feel the thing building, and to control them, a crescendo, so that the treble instruments aren't getting too loud too soon, or that the bass instruments are going to be supportive enough, or that the bass instruments are predominant and everything else is building. Yet I'm turned on by a really clean, articulate techniques, staccato, or intelligent slurring and all. Thinking back again to the Bavicki Festival Symphony on that recording, the final allegro is so exciting because of the energy, and everyone seems to be thinking the same way as to the climaxes. It's unison rhythm. There's probably all 12 notes of the chromatic scale sounding at once, but it's like blocks, like rocks. There's so much energy that, but you can't have a full program of that. It wears out the audience, wears out the musicians. I try to think always, I wonder what the audience is thinking. I want them to like what they're hearing, I want them to be curious enough to hear it again. Hence, doing some pieces more than once.
Yeah, you were famous for that. Once is not enough. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you weren't afraid to program things that might be challenging for the audience.
Yeah, that's right. I used to ask the audience how many liked it, how many didn't like it. And I would ask the band the same question. And the audience would always laugh, and an appreciable number of the band would raise their hands as not liking it.
Yeah.
You know, and I over the years, of course, have seen the change in MIT students. A student, a particular class of freshmen, as to how many would have voted that they didn't like a piece in their freshman year, and in their senior year, oh yeah, I like this piece. You know, I've opened the door, this opened their ears to modern music and contemporary music, and many students who've written to me and contributed to that wonderful book of memoirs that was given to me in the 50th anniversary concert. You know, there were letters in there of people that I turned them on to listening to contemporary music.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Looking at the concert band repertoire today, who are some of the composers who are writing, serious works for band as part of their natural inclination, not just commissions? I mean, as many composers just write orchestral music because they want to. Who are some of the composers writing for concert band and wind ensemble like that? Because so often the band works are special commissions. And I'm thinking of people like Roger Nixon, who seem to write quite a bit. So.
Well,
And have attitudes changed?
I think Granger was one, but this is not contemporary. It was happening today.
Yeah.
Madden writes for band quite a great deal. He has other people performing his music. I'm not the only one playing Madden. Well, this list, looking through this band repertoire, doesn't give me the answer or the information I need to say this well. But some composers, you mentioned Nixon, Roger Nixon.
Yes.
I think of him as being in a stable, that there may be a certain publisher for whom he's writing X number of pieces each year, for the market, school stuff. Mills Music used to have a lot of composers in their stable. Some of them were good, like Martin Gould. But I've been a number of years now away from the public school scene as to what publishers have been, publishers putting out there's Rubank, which had a certain connotation, Rubank books, school
Right.
materials.
Right.
Now, whether they had a stable of composers, I don't know, but there are composers that I just avoid for that reason. Everything is in the key of B flat or the key of E flat.
Yeah.
Claude Smith is a name that comes to mind in that category.
Right.
And those are the composers I've tried to avoid at MIT.
Yeah, I remember those in high school.
I don't know how many on this list of stuff that we played once and never played again, whether that shows any of those names or not.
Well, what this raises for me, this question of the, there's a strong history of
Grunman is another name.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
With the strong tradition of bands in this country, military bands, high school bands, college bands, why there isn't more, and there aren't very many professional, wind ensembles and stuff, and why, with the strong tradition, particularly in college and high school and military bands, why the band doesn't have the same prestige as the symphony orchestra. You go to a conservatory and you take a music history class, they don't talk about that tradition at all, and it's quite curious to me why that is.
Well, that's certainly true in this part of the country, but I'm not sure whether it's as true out in the Southwest, Arizona. Ed Aja went on to get a doctorate degree in wind ensemble conducting in Arizona. His band is more common out there than orchestras. Here in the East, there aren't the professional bands there used to be. When I was at high school age, there was the Walter Smith Band. Of course, the Goldman Band was being broadcast. The Navy Band used to broadcast. And the Army Band would broadcast. The Marine Band, each of the service bands had a weekly broadcast. College bands were famous. The University of Michigan, I remember hearing them at Harvard when Michigan played Harvard. And they were wonderful. On the football field, it was like a beautiful organ I was hearing. Just because you play outdoors doesn't mean you have to play out of tune.
Right.
I've always been bothered by some of these championship halftime shows, field bands, that they learn all these maneuvers and rehearse 8 days a week or something like that, and yet they don't take time to tune, or at least tune well enough. And when I would be asked to adjudicate a band festival, an out-of-door band festival, I used to harp on the fact that take time to tune, take time to listen. No matter what intricate movements you're doing and dance steps and all, gee, I feel a decline in all of that locally, meaning here in the East. I'm not sure whether I answered your question.
That's a tough question. I mean, it's just interesting. You open up a book on the history of music in the United States, and they don't talk about the symphonic band repertoire. They'll talk about orchestral music and chamber music, and piano music, and opera, but symphonic. I mean, even the Grove Dictionary of Music. There's an article on military band music, but there's no article on symphonic band music.
I have at home books on band music, which I've used for reference, looking
Right.
for ideas. Um, and I have two copies of the Roman book. I have a book on the history of bands. I have a book on Granger. Um, and I've just received within the last 4 weeks a list of all the musicians who played for Sousa.
Wow.
And I knew some of them. I'm that old that I remember Jake Newton and Oscar Short had played with them. And my brother will know those when I see him later this month.
Wow.
The Sousa band, of course, that was before FM radio and all that, when the Sousa band used to take culture around the country,
Right.
play transcription to Wagner. I think the English must have kind of led the way into original works being performed.
Right.
Of course, the English come in two sizes. There's the brass band and the military band.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and I have some brass band recordings, amazing. Musically not that interesting. And I have a tape that is just so ridiculous. I should make a copy of that for you. I don't know, it's like a trip to Niagara Falls or something like that, the name of it. It's a band piece. Trip to Niagara or something.
Wow.
I'll check it out and get that to you.
Wow. Moving on specifically to the MIT bands and just your work as a conductor, you were pretty famous for the method about how you introduced new music to the band and guided them through rehearsals. Tell me a little bit about that.
Say it again.
You were. Tell me about when you had a new piece of music and you were introducing it to the band, and what were some of the methods that you used to rehearsal, techniques, and just explaining the piece to the band, and how did that work for you?
Well, I think one of the most important things with a brand new piece, everyone's looking at it for the first time, and you should be wrong to start at the beginning, because it might go well for a half a minute or so and breaks down. And then if you did it again, it broke down the same spot. That's always going to be the spot where it broke down. A long time ago, I learned to find the most ingratiating spot in a piece. Find the spot that's going to sound well right off. Even if it's a case of doing only all the woodwinds, now all the brass, now everyone, including the percussion. Find a spot so it's going to sound well, even if it's only a matter of 16 measures or so. And if the thing is repeated later on in the piece or earlier in the piece, do it again. So you've got something sounding well right away. Sometimes it's a good idea to start at the end of the piece and do only the last few measures. Now back up and do the last 20 measures. Of course, the last few measures are going to get better all the time. You end up backing up and do the last 40 measures, or whatever, to approach it from the back. And then if it's possible, and then time will permit, you can talk about it to just describe the shape of it. It's going to be fast, slow, slow, and then a short finale, so they get the shape of the thing. Then try to run the whole thing with a minimum of stopping, so they feel like we can learn this. So they come away from the experience not dreading having to do it next week or the next rehearsal.
Mm-hmm.
That this is a piece that we're getting better at each time.
Now, if it was a piece that that the band found puzzling or curious, or maybe not even liking it, how did you deal with issues like that at the beginning?
Keeping in mind that when you work with a few players among everyone, that the others are all just having to sit there and wait, sometimes takes just little fragments of the piece, and then add more instruments for that same fragment. Then finally get to, so everyone, even if it's just a certain set of 4 or 5 measures, but keep everyone busy, so they're either following it if they're not actually playing it. You can sometimes say, I'd like to start at number 13, and we're going to go as far as 23, and play the note at 23. Play that note and hold it. Tune the note so it sounds better, even if it's a dissonant chord or something. And even dissonances can sound, so that sound. Now go back, and we'll have the woodwinds only play beginning at measure 13. Everyone come in on the note at number 23, and you play that much, so that all the others are following it, so they'll know when to come in on 23. So there's some learning going on, even though they're not blowing their instruments.
Mm-hmm.
Each piece is different. I think probably the piece I had in mind as I was saying all that was the Kalindros piece, the Greek piece. It was so angular, so difficult, so hard to find ensemble type places. There are sections of a piece that I won't do until the last few rehearsals, because they're so simple that they're not going to need much maturation time.
Right.
But it's early on. It's good to have an idea on what, if the concert is here, at what date do I want to be in condition to do the whole piece without stopping. So it can be done consecutively. Because as soon as you start doing things consecutively, the more people realize we're committed to this. This is going to be done here. So we might as well buckle down and learn it. But also it'll take shape. And where you've had to work hard to get a certain climax, you can perhaps just start beating time and they'll make the climax because it's in the parts. So I'm relying on the intelligence of the musicians and the sensitivity of the ears and all of that to make the thing go.
Well, speaking of the musicians, thinking of the MIT concert band, these are really motivated but non-professional musicians. Tell me what it's like working with them and how that's different from some of the other groups that you've worked with.
Working with the MIT?
Yeah.
Well, MIT is such a pleasure to work with such intelligent young people. Just because they don't play well, doesn't mean that they're not intelligent. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't be here if they weren't intelligent. They have a way of retaining, of remembering detail. If you've ended up phrasing a thing a certain way, provided I do the same thing each time, they'll phrase it the same each time. Or at least they'll be sensitive enough so I can change it a little bit and they'll follow. I may have said this before, but one of my favorite MIT-related comments that I would make to a high school festival group I would be rehearsing was that at MIT, if I said, in this phrase, make that last note staccato, put a dot on it, you'd see them, I'll take the pencil and dot that note and drop the pencils on the lip of the stand. You'd hear the sound. But then you'd also, in some pieces, you'd see them turn a page and put a dot on another spot. And they knew the tune came around in another spot. You know? Always thinking, always thinking. They may not practice, maybe just on the case, but they're thinking. It's been a joy.
Wow, wow. A lot of conductors have particular ideas for an ensemble sound that they're trying to cultivate. What were some of your ideas about, you know, the sound you're trying to get from the band?
Well, always looking for intonation problems. There are certain instruments that have certain notes that are always going to be sharp, or certain notes are always going to be flat. You need to know those notes. You need to be able to suggest an alternate fingering. In brass instruments, for example, if the note is always going to be flat, but the alternate fingering may make it sharp. What do you do to compensate for that? You push out a slide. So looking for the total sound, the ensemble sound, in good intonation, but also the way it is attacked, the beginning of that sound. Am I getting a different degree of attack from the brass than I am the woodwinds? Are the brass overbalancing the woodwinds? Now, not only do we get the beginning of the chord, right, but the end of it. A lot of groups can start a chord well, but they don't end together. It's like your fingers. Some drop off here, some drop off there, some drop off there. You have to wait. And sometimes you have to actually say to them, release this note on the rest. Release on the eighth rest. Or release on the end of the beat, you know. It's preordained as to when to stop, when to start a note. And those ingredients have to be correct if it's going to sound well in acoustics like Kresge. You know, you can hear so much in Kresge. On tour, when we go on tour, we were adjusting to different acoustics every day, and that was fun too. As you would hear the students thinking about when to release, when not to release. And the tour was such a great time.
Were there particular colors or sonorities that you were trying to cultivate in the band?
Yeah, a rich middle sound, a rich horn-like quality. I would like not to well, there are times when a shrill note, an almost abrasive sound is warranted. But 90% of the time, I think that you have to avoid an unpleasant projection, an unpleasant forcing of a high note or a loud note. In orchestra conducting, I was always asking for more sound, more depth, more pressure on the string, and in the wind, less sound. in band, it would be generally less sound, so that we're hearing the details from the moving parts, that sort of thing. But lots of time I would stop and ask the trombones, can you play louder? Stop in, is that as loud as you can play? Now everyone balance that. Some excitement in the sound. I must say I never felt that I really spent enough time balancing the percussion. Because the percussion should be treated like a choir. So that all the various instruments playing percussion are heard equally. That the bass drum isn't covering everyone else. That there's a wood block there. I want to hear the wood block. The triangle is frequently hold it up so it can be heard, so it'll project. You know, a lot of teaching.
Speaking of teaching, how did you see your role as a teacher and educator here at MIT?
Only that we were teaching players, whether it was orchestra or band, how to play their instruments, how to phrase once they could play the instrument, how to listen, how to adjust. And I would frequently make reference to recordings that they might like to consult, might listen to. We didn't take enough time to play recordings to the groups as we rehearsed them. I always wished that I had a rehearsal room where I could just push a button and record a passage and stop the group, rewind and play that passage, as a school man can usually do if he has a proper setup for rehearsals. Even rehearsing on stage, for all the many advantages, it had its disadvantage. It wasn't usually a blackboard you could go to in a hurry to draw something out or show some relationship. I don't feel I did enough teaching at rehearsals. We did hopefully enough teaching to get through the pieces, or program in such a way that we were going to have enough time to do enough teaching. You look at a score and say, this is going to take a lot of teaching. Look at another score, this will play itself. Gustav Holst is an example of something that will play itself. You know.
There's one question I wanted to ask you, but I might have to wait for another time. But maybe you could talk about it just briefly. What do you feel that what is the artistic function of a conductor? You know, either a band or an orchestra. I know that's a huge question, but are there particular ways that you think about that? What is you trying to do?
The artistic function. Well, the choice of repertoire is an important artistic decision. To pick repertoire, if you've got a concert down here, second semester, end of the semester that you're aiming for, what you do back here at the beginning of the year may affect what you're able to do down there. So I've frequently picked pieces for this part of the year, the beginning of the year. It was going to be good teaching pieces. That were going to make it easier to teach this piece that you hope to do at the end of the year. I say hope to do. You're at the the mercy of what you have for and players, of course. If you're having a year without French horns, you don't pick up a French horn piece down here. So you analyze what the makeup of the group is up here, and then find the pieces that are going to fit that instrumentation the best. One year I chose George Washington Bridge of William Schumann because I wanted a big sonorous sound, and the discipline of the length of note, whether it was in the staccato section or big half notes, when to cut off that half note. I was using that up in here a great deal. We never did it down to here because we had some other piece that was going to build off what we learned in this piece up here. I'm not sure whether that answers the question.
Yeah, that's a big question that there's no real easy answer to that. That's a question I thought would be interesting to ask you. Tell me about the MIT tours, how that got started, and why. What was the function of the tours?
In the early years, we used to take a weekend, do a weekend concert. For example, Vassar, which might be drive down, rehearsal in the afternoon, concert at night, stay overnight, and come back. And then that sort of thing grew into driving somewhere on Friday afternoon, playing a Friday night concert, and then driving the next day to somewhere else and having an afternoon rehearsal and an evening concert, and then playing an afternoon concert on Sunday coming home. It started out small like that. Then as it developed, we would be gone for sometimes 2 weekends and the time in between, which would give us maybe 7 or 8 days in which to do 6 or 7 concerts. Always thought there should be a certain balance between the number of miles traveled and the number of notes played, a ratio of some sort. It seemed it would have been crazy to go to Chicago and play one concert. We ended up playing a number of other concerts, which might be high schools or MIT clubs, plus the big concert that we were going to do at a certain college in the Chicago area. The committee, or students anyway, who would organize the tour would find out what high schools might be appropriate for the band to visit on tour and line them up geographically so that we weren't going from Boston to Pennsylvania to upper New York State and then down to Yale. We fixed it so we do things on line so the lineup made sense. When we went to Canada, more than once we go to Quebec City, then come back by Sherbrooke, 3 Rivers, 4 Rivers, I forgot the name of them, and end up in Montreal, that sort of thing. More than once we would play some high schools in Vermont and go to Montreal. Each year it was different, and I have files of each year. I say each year, there may be some missing years now, because we would sometimes go back another year.
So what were some of the memorable places you went?
I mentioned Quebec City and And the French concerts were always, the French concerts, the Canadian concerts were always well attended. Um, um, the ones at Quebec City in particular, we would go there during their winter festival. That was great fun. We played at New York, played at Town Hall, did the Baviki Symphony at Town Hall.
Wow.
And we were reviewed in the newspaper. And the reviewers, I remember, asked that we come back. We played out in Long Island. We went and do high schools out in Long Island, then end up coming into New York City at the Brooklyn. Gee, I forgot now the name of that. We did a broadcast over WNYC from somewhere in Brooklyn. It was a school in Brooklyn. We went up the Hudson River, played concerts all the way up to Albany. Having started out in New York, but I used to urge the committee to find concerts so that the last concert would be the best one, the biggest one, the most important concert, the finale concert. And sometimes it was in New York, sometimes it was at Yale. University of Pennsylvania was another finale concert. Washington, D.C. was a finale concert. We went to Florida more than once. Played even at a hospital in Florida. Of course, we played at Astronaut High School in Titusville, Florida, the day we saw the shuttle blow up, which was an experience. We were supposed to give a clinic in the afternoon, a concert for the school in the afternoon. Then I was to do a clinic with their band in the afternoon, and then a concert at night. When we got there, they had canceled school, and the concert, however, was continuing. We did do a concert that night with a packed house. People were standing. And this gentleman who was lighting his pipe out on the steps said after the concert, as I was coming out, he said it was a great concert. And I stopped and talked with him and said it must have been difficult for everyone to hear music. He said, well, we just had to do it to get away from the TV, get away from the radio. We lost 7 of our family today. We said, appreciate the fact that you played a concert to get our minds off the tragedy. And that summer, while I was sailing out in the harbor with Ira Schwartz, composer, I told him about that experience. I said, Ira, how about writing a piece about the shuttle disaster? And that's the challenge. Which is another piece that one of the students said, did the audience like hearing that? And I don't know, because it's a tragedy. If it doesn't leave you limp at the end of the piece, you failed somehow. I used to have to consciously take deep breaths so that I wouldn't go numb while conducting it, you know.
One more thing I want to ask you, and then we can decide if you want to take a break and come back or do another interview. But on a lighter note, the annual Halloween concerts. Tell me about some of those, how that got started, and some of the memorable things that happened at those.
You know, I don't know how it got started. It wasn't my idea. And when I tried to stop it and didn't do it one year, we had to answer a lot of questions. The idea was to do a concert in those acoustics, and the band would be in costume.
And this was in Lobby 7. Right?
Lobby 7.
Yeah.
Well, it was fun initially to find music that could go in those acoustics. I used to do actually Gabriele sonatas for brass with double choir, triple choir.
Right.
So, some of the Percy Grainger stuff would go well in Lobby 7. Some pieces were near disasters. I don't remember whether I started some pieces over if they didn't start out right, but we would demonstrate to the audience, you know, play a staccato chord, boom, and you'd hear it ring. The band, it was always amazing the way they could get through the concerts. Memorable experiences. Oh, they're all lumped into one now. But we did more than once Jericho with the offstage trumpets. The wall came tumbling down.
Did they always have costumes and stuff? Was that always part of that Halloween concert?
Yeah. I remember once Jim Bales came dressed as an octopus. He played the tuba. There's this octopus playing tuba. I think I have a picture of that.
Didn't that make it in the student paper or something? I've seen pictures of it.
One girl, one of the saxophone players, came dressed as the shuttle. But she didn't discover until she got to the concert that she couldn't sit down in it. You know, she had forgotten how that was solved. There was always something else on my mind. People not showing up in time or music missing or something. I dreaded that concert, really. To find the right pieces, get them ready in a matter of 3 weeks or so. We come, you know, we have to audition, seat the band, all that. And there was a family weekend concert in front of that by 2 weeks.
Wow. Well, this looks like a good place to take a break. So why don't we do that?